Good evening, everyone. Good evening and welcome. I'm really delighted to have a complete full house with standing room only. We really thank you for being here. I'm Jerry Sabloff, the president of the Santa Fe Institute, and it's, again, a pleasure to welcome you to the Ulam Lectures. They began in 1994, so this is the 18th annual Ulam Lecture. These lectures are named in honor of the great mathematician, the late Stanislaw Ulam, who was part of the Manhattan Project and subsequently lived in Santa Fe. As part of his legacy, his library now forms the core of the Santa Fe Institute Library today. I also want to take note of the very sad passing of Françoise Ulam, who died this past April at the age of 93. Great friend of the Institute and many here in Santa Fe, but I'm really pleased that the Ulam's daughter, Claire, and son-in-law, Steve Weiner, are here with us tonight, and delighted they're with us. As always, we gratefully acknowledge the support of the Los Alamos National Bank, which supports our entire public lecture series, and we have one more, as you noted on the slides, coming up in October this year, and also Jerry and Katie Peters and the Peters Family Foundation for their generous support of the 2011 Ulam Lectures. It's now my really great pleasure to introduce Jim Rutt, who's the chair of the Santa Fe Institute Board of Trustees, who will introduce our 2011 Ulam Lecture. Jim?
Thank you, Jerry. It's a real privilege and an honor, actually, to introduce David Krakauer tonight. David was one of the first people I really got to know at the Institute when I showed up there in 2002, and we had certain overlapping interests. And as I started talking to him, I realized, now this is a mega mind. My little interests were about 1/10 of his brain, and and he fully covered everything I was interested in, which was quite incredible. And as I got to know him better, I realized that even what I saw at first was just a little piece of this amazing concept of the world in the context of what he's going to be talking about here tonight, from the very small to the very large, and having to do with how information is processed and stored and changed and used, etc. Some of the things that have amazed me about David and his way of thinking is how he is rigorously consistent in applying the same methodologies from very small level things at the molecular level up to the various highest level things. And kind of to refresh kind of the breadth of the work that he's done over the years, I went back and looked at some of his publications and found things at very low level, very specific reactions in the chains of information within a cell, all the way up to some of his recent work in a new journal called Cliodynamics, the mathematical and theoretical study of history. So it doesn't get much broader than that. And again, David is not a dilettante in anything he does. The rigor that he brings to the small is he brings the same level of intellectual rigor and the same level of intellectual honesty to these very large, very innovative questions, which are just now starting to become tractable by what you might call real scientific methods. And so I'm really looking forward to this, frankly, and expect to learn a lot and to sort of see this mega mind, cook it all down to 3 evenings. I think should be a real adventure. David started his academic career at the University of London, where he got a degree in biology and mathematics, and something I did not know until yesterday, also computer science. And he then went and got a PhD from Oxford in evolutionary theory. Again, an interesting, very unusual specialty. And then he stayed at Oxford for a little while and went on, got a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. And then he finally came and joined us here at the Institute in, 2001, 2002, David? And has been here since, and has been a true adornment to the Institute. And again, I enjoy introducing him, and I look forward to his program tonight. David, come take it away. You all wired up. Okay.
This is the first test of the Megamind. And I passed. That's extremely flattering and incredibly misleading introduction. As you'll see, hopefully in this lecture series, if you do choose to come back, there aren't any Megaminds. This is an illusion. I should say right at the start, there are many of you here tonight, and it's extremely flattering, and I'm genuinely appreciative, but it's going to get so much better tomorrow, and the third night especially. And so you really ought to come back every night, because it's just going to get better and better. And okay, so let's get started. I have this little convention I'm going to be using in this lecture series, and I'm not sure if you can read that at the back, but it says, wear your thinking cap or your brain is at risk. I will let this drop down whenever there's a possibility of a more technical section to the talk, and you can either sit up, pay attention, or text message, according to your disposition. I should say, and Jerry already did, that I'm immensely grateful and very flattered to be giving a lecture series commemorating these two extraordinary people. I picked out these two quotes. This one on the left is a quote about Stan Ulam by Françoise Ulam, where she says, Ulam is almost exclusively a talking man, a verbal person when not thinking. What he enjoys most is to talk, to discuss, to argue, to converse with friends and colleagues. Relying on his phenomenal memory, he carries everything in his head. And I'm very susceptible to personalities who can't shut their mouths, because I'm one myself. And this was in Françoise Ulam's recent obituary in the local paper. She was a trenchant observer of human events, from the mundane to the historic, and her individualistic charm and warm wisdom will be missed greatly by friends and family. I didn't know either of them, but it's certainly an honor to be talking about intelligence named after two such extraordinary intelligent people. So what is it? What is intelligence? I am a little averse to definitions, and I've said this a few times recently, because definitions often give you a false sense of comprehension. Imagine I was giving a lecture series 3 nights on the topic of love, and you started off by saying, yes, but tell us what it is first. There's something incredibly simple-minded about that. You'd ask me to give you examples, introduce you to concepts that in aggregate give you a sense of what that concept implies. And I'll do the same with intelligence. Nevertheless, many people have tried and failed. The history is daunting because intelligence is, and presumably that's why there are so many of you here tonight, the central organizing concept for our species. If you were to say, what is it that makes humans humans? Well, it's something like intelligence, and that distinguishes us from the rest of animate nature. And for some people, like this chap, takes us closer to God. This is Thomas Aquinas. This is a quote from the Summa Theologica, written in the 14th century. And for him, building on Aristotle, who claimed that thought was something like light, non-corporeal, non-material, it was this thing that demonstrated our unique status in relation to the divine. I'm a little bit more susceptible to the more ironical frame of mind, like Henry Lewis, and I'll let you read that for yourselves, who didn't have... It's interesting, you'll have more or less exactly the same reading latencies. And so he was not as fond as humans as perhaps Thomas Aquinas and others might have been, at least on paper. So in the 18th century, there was an attempt to measure it, and it was truly ludicrous. It was based on what they thought was the outward expression of our intelligence in anatomy. And so over here you have a typical picture from a book on craniometry, where you're measuring the dimensions of the head, and that was supposed to give you an insight into how smart someone was. Here's phrenology, where you can basically palpitate the scalp, and by looking at the distribution of bumps on the head, determine how smart someone was. And it led to all sorts of extraordinary claims, where simply by looking at correspondences in outward visage, you can conclude what the character of someone might be. So this man is leonine. He has a ferocious intellect, because he looks so much like a lion. So most of you will be familiar with intelligence from intelligence tests. So this is an attempt to reduce all of the complexity of your thought to one number. And so I don't really have to say much more than that for you to realize how ludicrous that is. The history, though, is interesting. This is Binet, Alfred Binet, and he was a French psychologist, and he was interested in pedagogy. and how we could improve the education of children who were challenged in one way or another. So his motivation for working on IQ tests was actually, I think, quite honorable, because he wanted to identify potential weaknesses and improve them. And the kinds of tests that we associate with Binet are these kinds of geometric associative tests, and don't worry about trying to answer it. There's no test this evening. And here we are. Here's a characteristic score sheet. Unfortunately, Binet's ideas were somewhat abused by an American. Actually, he's over here. This is Henry Goddard. He was a eugenicist. That means he believed in breeding humans. And he wanted to use the IQ test to improve the average intelligence of the American people. And he would do that by testing people and sterilizing people who didn't reach the threshold score. And so it's interesting, the intelligence from Aquinas to Goddard was always, in some sense, contaminated with ideological goals. It wasn't necessarily a very scientific pursuit. More or less coincident with the work of Binet is this guy, Wolfgang Kohler. And Kohler was a Darwinian, and he was interested in the idea that perhaps some of the precursors to what we consider intelligence in humans were present in non-human animals, like chimpanzees. And he was really a visionary, and he argued very forcefully, and I think quite convincingly, that non-human animals had true insight, not just simple-minded reinforcement intelligence, which we'll get to. And this tradition has continued, and I'm going to show you a short video of a recent study coming out of Tokyo on intelligence in chimps that might surprise you. There should be sound here, by the way. Let's go back. Yeah, so there is no sound output on this computer. It should be plugged into the sound. I even rehearsed that earlier on today, so I was aware of it. I was aware of the possibility. Yes. So tell me if this works. No. Are you going to give me a sign, or do you guys have it up there? Okay, I'm going to play it again.
Memory.
There you go, thank you.
This footage from Kyoto University's Primate Research Institute shows a young chimpanzee taking a memory test. Not only is he reading
Counting
and
numbers.
understanding the numbers, he's able to remember their exact positions after seeing them flash on a screen for less than a second. Apes consistently get 10 in a row correct, while humans rarely reach 6 before failing.
Right. No, and I think you should take this very seriously, okay? I think a lot of people don't realize that. We're not quite as special as we think, and I make that, but we are not alone. I think a lot of our interest in intelligence and trying to find it elsewhere, whether it's in God or some other metaphysical conceit, for me, is loneliness, existential loneliness. We want something else to talk to, but we're not alone. So here are some examples of definitions. These are some of the more sensible definitions. The ones that I don't like are the circular ones, where they say, intelligence is that which is measured in an intelligence test, which is okay. And that's what the people in Mensa like so much, because that's all they can do. And so you'd ask them, have you used your intelligence in an interesting way? And well, I have a high IQ. Now, if you look at these definitions of intelligence, some of you will be thinking, that sounds awfully familiar. The faculty of adapting to circumstances, to deal effectively with the environment. If I were to mention those sentences and think and ask you, free associate a theory, what would the theory be? Evolution. It sounds an awful lot like evolution, and I'm going to show you that it is an awful lot like evolution. But by those definitions, you will note that the smartest organism on the planet is E. coli, a gut bacterium. Okay. So I'm going to try and give you my insight. I know It gets better. It just gets better. I'm going to give you my insight into intelligence, and you'll see there are some Rubik's Cubes on the stage, and I just want you to think about something, and this prop, I'm now going to make use of the prop. I'm not going to solve it, but I'll show you something. Notice the following. Notice how hard it is for me to go from this configuration, where the faces are, in some sense, randomized, and I'm not quite sure how to do it, but I'm sure someone in the audience can do it in 6 seconds, which is the record. But how easy it is for me to go from this beautiful, pristine cube and totally mess it up. Why is it easy, right, easy to do that, but very hard to do the opposite? What's going on? And in that distinction lies the essence of difficulty and the essence of intelligence. So here's a guy, it took him 26 years. There's this wonderful quote here. It says, his wife, Jean, 47, I don't know if they write that in American newspapers, but they always have to give the age in English, said it felt like there had been 3 people in their marriage. 2 people and a cube, and it's up for you to decide which were the cube. What I'm going to show you now is a competition where a young kid, he's presented with a Rubik's Cube like this. He gets to look at it, to remember where the colors are. He can't manipulate it. And then he's going to put a blindfold on, and he's going to solve it blindfolded. That's what you're going to see. So here he is, being shown the randomized cube, and he's inspecting it. Notice he's not manipulating it. No, he's not otherwise compromised. This kid is really smart. Okay, we're almost there. Last look. On it goes. Okay. It's sort of okay, so what we have here, I would do the same. 26 years, 45 seconds blindfolded. Now, most of you would say, wait, so who's smarter? Well, that's a hard one. The record for solving the Rubik's Cube without a blindfold is 5 seconds from a random initial configuration. How does he do it? What's going on here? Okay. So I alluded to this sort of idea when I was telling you what was more, or demonstrating which was more difficult. In some sense, this has to do with probabilities, with odds. The easy thing to do is to get the Rubik's Cube wrong, right? Because there are many, many, many ways to do it wrong. There's one way to get it right. It turns out, in fact, that there's a 1 in 43 quintillion probability of getting it right. So you're never going to do it by chance alone. Okay? So somehow, what we mean by intelligence, right, is moving from a very probable configuration, easy, to a very difficult one, improbable. In fact, intelligence is fundamentally about searching for answers in what we would call scientifically a very high-dimensional space. Now, you might say, wait a minute, there are other things that are hard in that way, like athletic prowess. So, for example, getting a basketball into a basket. Well, that's improbable too, because there are so many ways of throwing it in the wrong direction, getting it the exact right trajectory. But we don't think that's intelligence. After all, that's not intelligence. That's talent. Well, I'm here to tell you that that distinction is totally bogus from the point of view of your brain. You care about that distinction. Culture cares about the distinction. Your brain doesn't. And as a matter of fact, in terms of the number of calculations required for your brain to solve a Rubik's Cube, as opposed to getting a ball into a basket in a parabolic trajectory while in motion, is far more complicated. We can build computers that solve a Rubik's Cube effortlessly. There is no such computer or robot that can play basketball. Okay? It's a harder computational problem. So, okay, you're saying, wait a minute, maybe this is an abuse of the concept of intelligence, because granted, computationally, athleticism is perhaps more difficult, but we have something else in mind. What we have in mind is deduction. What we think intelligence really is not being good at tennis, after all, because, damn it, that guy's better than me, and he's certainly not smarter than I am. It's sort of solving problems deductively. And we'll get into what these things mean in a minute. Somehow what mathematicians do, that's smart, but not sport. I'm going to be arguing over the course of these lectures that prejudice, that conceit, that unscientific assumption has led to us not really comprehending what intelligence is. And that it really refers to a much more general set of mechanisms which include deduction, but also include motor induction, athletic ability. And the key to understanding it will be to break it down into 4 constituents. One I call representation or encoding, inference, and strategy. So just to make that a little bit more obvious, if you see an apple at the other side of the room and you want to eat it, first of all you have a strategy. It says, I want the apple. You have a goal. Okay? Then you have to represent in your mind's eye moving towards the apple and eating it. Right? So that's a representation. And then you have to do a computation which tells your legs how to move to reach your target. So any act of intelligence always has at least these 3 ingredients, right? A goal, a representation, and a computational active inference. And we'll get into these in some detail because tonight I want to lay the ground plan for what's about to come. How do machines do this? Do they do this? And so competition is the 4th, because competition is the thing that I'll be telling you that generates representations, allows you to do inference, and so forth. So here's a simple example of the Rubik's Cube, but it's like a coin, it's not a Rubik's Cube, and I'm going to say to you, manipulate the coin such that from an arbitrary starting configuration, heads is up. Okay, you think, well, I can do that, right? It's not a hard search problem, right? It's not fundamentally different from the Rubik's Cube, right? And you say, good, got it, heads up, X probability 1 for X heads. Now, this way of thinking about intelligence has its roots in some very interesting theories in physics, and this will be a little bit of an introduction to some ideas that you might not be familiar with. And so here we have our little... It's not difficult, it really isn't. It just might seem a little bit abstract. In the 19th century, there was a great interest in what a law of physics was. So we had sort of law theory of gravity, which is a law of electromagnetism, which is a law. And these were a slightly different kind of law. These were laws in thermodynamics, and these were what are called statistical laws, the theory of heat and temperature and pressure, and the concept that I'll be using, entropy. So entropy basically means, for our purposes, randomness. So when you take a Rubik's Cube and you shuffle it, you're increasing the entropy, making it more random. But when you solve it, you're reducing the entropy, making it more ordered. So entropy, in some sense, captures what we mean by being intelligent, because it's by reducing it, you're solving a search problem. And this was a big problem for the universe, because why, if entropy always increases, which, by the way, is the law, the second law of thermodynamics, entropy always increases, why is the universe ordered? Right? Why is the Earth here? Why did the Earth accrete? Why are we here? Why doesn't everything just randomize? And the argument typically is that the universe is like a Rubik's Cube, that at the very beginning was started in the ordered state, and in time it's being shuffled. But sometimes there can be minor deviations from that second law, which lead to ordered states like our solar system. And Maxwell thought about it in the following way. Imagine that you have a box like this, and that box has a wall in the middle, and there are particles that move fast, and there are particles that move slowly. And if you take the average of things moving fast, we call that hot, and if you take the average of things moving slowly, that's called cold. That's what hot and cold are. And he imagined a little demon, and the demon would have a little lever. And whenever a hot particle moved from your right to left, he would let it through. right? A cold from left to right, you'd let it through, but not anything else. And in time, you'd move from a situation where hot and cold particles, fast and slow, are randomly distributed to one where you have all hot in one chamber and all cold in the other. It's like the Rubik's Cube, right? Maxwell's demon was me, or that smart kid, solving the Rubik's Cube, moving to a configuration of low entropy, not randomness. And a very famous, another physicist, William Thomson, who you might know as Lord Kelvin, said, for that to be possible, for a system to move out of equilibrium, you'd need an intelligent demon. Because the demon has to see the individual particles, right? And he has to decide, based on judging their velocity, whether they should go left or right. Okay? So the only way you could violate the second law of thermodynamics was through an intelligent agent. As I'll show you in the third lecture, intelligence doesn't mean divine or us. It could be a robot or a simple mechanism, but nevertheless, it has to have representation, inference, and strategy. Now, something interesting happened in the 19th century in parallel. So this was about how the universe gets ordered. There was another theory. We call it Darwin's theory of natural selection. And Darwin independently discovered the Maxwell's demon. Didn't realize it, and he discovered it first. But you turn the box on its head, and instead of having left and right, you have time instead of space. So you have generation 1 and generation 2. And organisms that are well adapted to the environment get to pass through this filter, like the particle did, and the ones that don't stay behind. And this demon, instead of looking at particle velocities, looks at how well adapted they are to the environment. It's exactly the same thought experiment. Turns out you can write them down the same way mathematically. Okay? But the Darwin's demon is much more complicated, because it's not just fast and slow, it's structure, right? Whether they've got legs or arms or wings or leaves and so forth. There's another characteristic of the Darwin's demon, which is very interesting, and that is in time, the particles, that's Archbishop Wilberforce, who doesn't make it through, except in the annals of sort of embarrassing history. What happens to the particles is they come to represent the selection pressure itself. So what we are as organisms, as we evolve, are reflections of the selection pressure. And think about it, to survive, you have to predict the world in which you live, and to predict it, you need to model it. Okay? So a big difference between living systems and non-living systems, right, is even though there might be some proto-intelligence in the physical one, the biological one does this representational trick. And it's kind of a hard thing to get your head around, but it's critical. And so, hence the title, Where's This Adversarial Quartet? For the last 10 years, I've been sort of worrying about, well, does thermodynamics have anything to do with evolution? What does this have to do with cognition? It felt to me, almost at some level, they were all related. And recently, I feel I've made a little bit of progress. And there are a set of theories that all look unbelievably similar. So here's the Maxwell theory, and that's about the selection of improbable states, like the cube, right? Darwin's theory, the selection of organisms, the theory of learning, of operant conditioning, the selection of behavior. If you do something repeatedly that gets rewarded, you'll do it more often. And the theory of games, which is about strategy, the selection of strategy. And when you write these down mathematically, they all look the same. And so it looks as if there's a more general theory, which I would call a general theory of intelligence, that subsumes all of these other theories. Okay, this one's kind of interesting because, as I said, it's physical, whereas all of these are living. But it will make the point that I want you to understand, that physical systems do have proto-intelligence, a simple form of representation. Okay, so that's the sort of hard bit. Here's an interesting point. I was looking for quotes. Did Darwin sort of get this at all? Darwin sort of seemed to have got everything at some point, a bit like Aristotle. You'll eventually find something, Darwin, oh no, Darwin did it. And this is a quote from a notebook. It's called Notebook M. He always labeled his notebook. M meant metaphysics and morals. He wrote it when he was 29. He'd gone back from the Beagle by then. And he says, free will is to mind what chance is to matter, sort of alluding to the possibility that there was a connection between fundamental theories of entropy in non-living systems and randomness in living systems. So now I'm going to tell you what these things mean, and it will be fairly straightforward. because I'm going to build on them as we move along over these 3 nights. And I'm going to give you nice examples that I think will surprise you about what non-human animals can do representationally and inferentially. I'll say less about strategy because everyone, I think, knows what that means. And in lecture 3, I'll talk about it in relation to machines that would like to beat us at various games. Don't worry about that. It doesn't really matter. Let's go to this.
Vem är du?
Jag är döden.
Kommer du för att hämta mig?
Jag har redan länge gått vid din sida.
Det vet jag.
Är du beredd?
Min kropp är rädd. Inte jag själv. Vänta ett ögonblick.
Så säger ni alla. Men jag lämnar inga uppskov.
Du spelar ju schack, inte sant?
Hur vet du det?
Ja. Jag har sett det på målningar och hört i visorna.
Ja, jag är verkligen en ganska skicklig schackspelare.
Du kan ändå inte vara skickligare än jag.
Varför vill du spela schack med mig?
Det är min sak.
Det har du rätt i.
Villkoret är att jag får leva så länge jag står emot. Spelar jag det matt, friar du mig. Du fick svart.
Det passar ju bäst så. Inte sant?
Right, so death is vain, right? And not very frightening. I mean, if that was death approaching me, I wouldn't be too concerned. So, where did Bergman get this idea? It's quite interesting. The idea came from a mural in a church just north of Stockholm in Sweden, painted by Albertus Pictor in 1480. And it's in a tradition of popular visual Bibles. It's hard, I couldn't find a source for an earlier representation of chess where death is playing a knight. But the point about chess is interesting, and that is that it's become somehow the canonical problem for us to solve if we want to understand intelligence. In lecture 3, I'll talk about this a lot. Why is it that chess is so important to us, even though it's so removed from everyday life? We all know that chess players are good at nothing but chess, right? Especially the very good ones. Why is it the model of intelligence? It's so weird, right? And I'm going to claim that the reason it's the model of intelligence is because it has all of the ingredients of the intelligence. That is, it has inferential properties, representational properties, strategic properties, and highly competitive properties that culminate in death, because fundamentally that's what the stakes are in this game. Intelligence is about cheating or outwitting death, as the knight did in the Seventh Seal. So here are some quotes just to make my point. This is a Sasanian king of the 7th century. If a ruler does not understand chess, how can he rule over a kingdom? Probably very well. Right? We know the answer to that one. Nevertheless, it was believed that to train yourself to be a great warrior, you'd be better if you understood chess. Here's another one with representation. This is kind of beautiful from Koestler. When a chess player looks at the board, he does not see a static mosaic, a still life, but a magnetic field of forces charged with energy, as Faraday saw the stresses surrounding magnets and currents as curves in space, or as Van Gogh saw vortices in the skies of Provence. Pretty amazing. And here is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, of course, the writer of the Sherlock Holmes. There's not the mystery in 10 murders that there is in one game of chess. Okay. So that's what's going on. Chess is actually challenging us to think about these 3 characteristics very carefully. So let me now talk about representation and flesh out these concepts in a little bit more depth. So one of the most famous representations that you're all familiar with in culture is number systems. Here is the Babylonian number system written on a cuneiform tablet. It's base 60, right? Sexagesimal, it's a great word. Here's Mayan, this is in honor of Jerry. This is base 20. They also had the 0. And here is the Roman decimal system. These are ways of representing numbers in the world abstractly. And they all have the property, right, of being universal in the sense that they can represent any number of arbitrary magnitude. Okay, so they're representations of number that are very powerful. But they have two other characteristics that I want you to understand, which is what are critical to comprehending representation. One of them is what I call compression of representation. And here's how you think about it. Here's the number 1994, and I've written it in Roman, in Babylonian, and Mayan. And from now on, I'm only going to write things in Arabic and Roman numerals, because it took me about an hour to understand how to do that, and I wasn't going to do it for every other number. And so here's another number, 3,998, and here it is written in Roman numerals. Here's 7,976, and you'll notice a pattern. Down here, we have an even more efficient way of representing decimal Arabic numbers. Here's Roman, that does pretty well. 1,000, oops, 10,000, oops. What is it about our number system? Well, it has this extraordinary property that you can write down arbitrarily large numbers in a very small space. This is a critical concept in representation, and it's a part of what I'm going to tell you intelligence is. Very efficient representation of a concept. Okay. Here's another one I'm going to call composition of representations. All of you in this room can effortlessly do this, right? Because you know you just have to add a 0. How do you know how to do it with Roman numerals? How does that work? It doesn't work. You do it by memory. Okay? There isn't a rule. And look down here, it gets worse. That's harder. There are probably very few of you who could do that in your heads, but you could easily do it on paper. That, on the other hand, would take you days on paper. Right? Unless first you turned it into that, and then you turned it back into that, which is cheating. Okay. Here's another one. This is very interesting. That is no harder than that, right? 1 million plus 1 million is 2 million. 1 plus 1 is 2. That's kind of extraordinary, that the difficulty of solving an arithmetic operation is independent of magnitude. And that's all a property of the representation. That's not true with many of the other number systems that I showed you. So now I'm going to go from cultural concepts of representation, just because I thought you would be familiar with them, to brain concepts of representation. Okay, so this is a famous Canadian neuroscientist, neurologist, Wilder Penfield. And he mapped the brain, literally. Okay. He was interested in performing operations on epileptic patients to remove the damaged tissue so that the electrical activity would no longer propagate to encompass the entire brain, which happens during a grand mal epileptic seizure. Okay. And to do that, he had to induce artificially a seizure. So he'd place an electrode on an exposed brain tissue, move it around until he hit the point which was the locus of damage, and he would realize that's the thing I should remove. It's sort of barbaric, but the procedure worked fairly well. In the process, he realized that by moving this pin over the brain, they were feeling sensations in their body. Like a pin here would make your toe tingle, a pin here would make your finger. And he realized that he could map to the surface of the brain the surface of the body, because you knew what the corresponding points were. So this was your finger, ooh, that was your palm, and so forth. And that's what these maps are. Okay? So this is cerebral cartography. And that's what your body looks like represented on your hemispheres. Okay? So you'll see some interesting patterns. You'll see that your hand takes up a lot of brain tissue, right? Whereas your forehead or your back doesn't, right? And this is this notion of the efficiency of representation, because the more sensitive the area, the more brain tissue it requires. Okay? So that's what I mean by efficiency here. And here you can see the tongue. It's kind of ugly. It takes up a huge amount of space. So this is kind of funny. So if you look at how at least the Western male, with one possible modification, would like to view himself under ideal circumstances, that's how we might like to think of ourselves. This is how our brain, in fact, sees us, males. Now, we've corrected the one possible problem, but we've unfortunately introduced a whole number of others that seem insurmountable. But the point you'll see that's rather intriguing is that the brain, as I said before, apportions more neural real estate to areas where you require greater dexterity or sensitivity. And here are some maps of animals, which are quite intriguing. Here's a raccoon. On a raccoon, it puts a ton of brain tissue onto its pads. Okay? Here's a cat and a rat, and they have a lot of representation on the face in the whiskers. The whiskers are incredibly sensitive. And this is kind of interesting. This is a squirrel. It's all lip. And I have no idea why squirrels need very sensitive lips, but that's what they are. Now, I mentioned, so that's efficiency, right? Now let's talk about composition, and this will surprise you. You're all familiar with the idea of a brain scan, and that's what these things are. And what you see over here is if you were to stick a big sensor over your head and you moved your foot or your arm, different parts of your brain would light up, right? And so here, look at this one. Blue foot movements when you move your foot, red finger movements, right? And it's nicely symmetric. But what's very surprising is if I say the word shin or toe, it maps to exactly the same neurons that the motion maps to. So that's actually very weird, right? So somehow, it's not only your sensory system that has a cerebral map, but the words associated with your limbs. They're composed in the same neural tissue. And I don't know if Sandy Blakesley is here tonight, but Sandy, who's a local writer on neuroscience, has been very interested in these kinds of phenomena. So it has another feature, which is this competitive feature, and this you probably all know by intuition. And here's another brain scan, and I'm going to show you the following. You ask two groups of people to memorize words, a group of blind people and a group of sighted people. Okay? And here are the number of words, and this is the percentage of words remembered. The first thing to note is that the sighted people only go up to about 84%, and the blind group has a much better memory for words. Okay? But the other interesting pattern is what you're actually measuring here is the activity of the visual cortex, not the area that normally remembers words at all. Okay? What's happened in these blind people is that the area of the brain that normally remembers visual scenes or contributes to seeing the world has been taken over by neurons that represent words. So brain tissue has this interesting characteristic that if it's not being used, it can be requisitioned for another function, competitively. All right. So competition among cells sharpens representations and recruits neural resources, blah, blah. Okay. So that was a little bit on representation, okay, making analogies between our external representations of number and efficiency and compositionality and the brain's way of doing it. Now this will, I think, the Santa Fe audience will particularly enjoy because it's about art. Now, many people would say, yeah, when it comes to movement, everything can do that. But there are things that we can do that no other species could possibly do. For example, art appreciation. Right? I mean, humans uniquely appreciate music and fine art and so forth. I'm going to show you that's absolutely untrue. And in fact, that pigeons can outperform art critics. Before I do that, I need to introduce you to the basic concept of inference. So you've all heard of deduction and induction. Maybe you haven't heard of abduction. So what's deduction? Well, that's the sort of idea, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, that sort of stuff you had to learn about deduction. Induction is slightly more interesting, and that's when you go to the window in the morning and you see that everything's wet, and you say, it probably rained last night. That doesn't follow logically, right, from the axioms, but it follows from experience. That's what induction's all about. Abduction is the hardest one, associated with Charles Peirce, and abduction is the construction of truly novel ideas, not deductively or necessarily experientially, but sort of out of nowhere. And it's the one that I think science has made almost no progress on. So here's deduction, right, in its purest form. This is the Principia Mathematica, PM, to those who know it well. It was written in the 1910s, and just to show you how hard deduction is, it was written by, of course, Whitehead and Russell. Here's page 362, and by page 362, you've worked out that 1 + 1 = 2. No, you laugh, that's very hard to do it deductively from first principles. Okay, so here's induction. Here's a weak form of induction. Many of you will see two things in that image. You'll see a face that actually looks rather like the young Charles Darwin, actually, prematurely balding. But it also looks like a lady wearing a fur coat in a wood about to cross a bridge in some unspecified Middle European capital, right? That doesn't follow logically. It follows from your experience of vision, seeing scenes. It's a form of visual induction. Here's a strong form of induction. This is Isaac Newton. So Isaac Newton was told about the orbits of the planets, and he was able to write down his so-called inverse square law of gravity, where he somehow condensed a lot of observation into that little formula, right, which says that the strength of gravity is proportional to the product of the masses divided by the distance squared times a constant. That's induction 2. Let's now get to that light's sort of weird. It's moving around. Okay, who painted that? Monet. Yes, you see, if I put an equation, you go, oh, no, I'm not sure. But when it comes to painting in this community, who painted that? Picasso. How about that one? Monet too, slightly less well known. How about that? I've got kind of Picasso 50%, Braque 50%. It's actually Picasso, but it's reasonable. So, that requires quite a bit of knowledge, right? You have to been to a number of art galleries, and you can impress your friends by saying, that's a lesser-known Braque. Well, here's a pigeon that's going to do exactly the same thing. So this is some work that came out of Japan. The Japanese seem to be doing beautiful studies on animal cognition in '95, and what they did is the following. They trained pigeons to be able to identify paintings by Monet or Picasso. Okay? So what you do is, like us, you take them to an art gallery, you show them, they say, that's a Monet. And not quite, but you reward them. You reward them in a sort of Skinner box. You say, learn that. Yes, you got it right. And you reward them for choosing the right artist. And here are the results. I'm a bit daunting, but they're quite interesting. So here is a pigeon. It's trained on Monet. And I'm going to explain what this means. This means how often they respond. Think of it as how often they get it right. And here is a pigeon trained on Monet, and this is what it does when it sees a Monet. It starts pecking a lever. Monet, Monet, Monet. Okay? If you give it a Picasso, it doesn't peck the lever at all, or very rarely. So now these are paintings that they've seen in the past. So this is a test of memory. Right? Is that a Monet or a Picasso? Oh, it's a Monet, right? Now look over here. These are pigeons trained on Picasso. Okay? And they do the same thing in reverse, right? You show them a Picasso, go, Picasso, Picasso, give them a Monet, no, I don't know what that is. Okay? But now you see something very intriguing. What this means down here, I'm not sure at the back if you can see that, that's the Monet. This is when you take the Monet and you flip it left to right. And this is the Monet when you turn it upside down. And you can see if you do that with a Monet to a pigeon who memorizes Monets, they do less well, right? They say, yeah, I think it's a Monet. It's certainly not a Picasso, but... And so that's what's happened here. It's been reversed. Doesn't do as well. But this is cool. Look what happens to the Picasso-trained pigeons. You show them a Picasso, right? And then, sorry, that's too good to skip, right? Go back. Yes, okay, all right. When the Picasso pigeons are trained, and you turn it upside down, they can't tell the difference, right? So it's like, or reverse it. Always the same. It's a Picasso, So not only do pigeons remember paintings, but they're incredibly reactionary art critics, right? Because that's precisely what your friends who don't like modern art always say. Well, you could turn it upside down, it wouldn't make any difference. Okay? Now, well, it isn't that easy, right? Let me do that again. That's not easy, right? That's an upside down Picasso and a right way up Picasso. Oops, which is the right way up? Okay. Now they also do, you'd say, well, that's just memory. Now I'm going to show you inference, I'm going to show you induction. So this is absolutely as before, but instead of showing them a Monet that they've seen before, you show them that they haven't seen before. So this is what we call out of sample, right? So this is testing them out of sample, and they do almost as well as the ones they can memorize. So you've never seen that painting by Monet before, so that's a Monet. Pigeons can do it. But what's even more remarkable is you show them a Cézanne or a Renoir, and they'll say, that's rather like Monet. Okay? But when you show them a Picasso, they'll say, no idea. But you do the same thing in reverse. You train them on Picasso, and again, you show them a new Picasso they've never seen, and they say, that's a Picasso. But then what you do is you show them a Braque or a Matisse, and they say, that's rather like Picasso. So not only can they identify artists' paintings that they've never seen before, but they can identify styles of art, okay? Which is, I think, much more than many of my friends, right? So I think this is truly remarkable, and it's worth knowing. So they can do induction at a very high level. It's a pigeon, a bird brain. One of these is a Picasso, one of these is a Braque. Any ideas? Look how similar. I mean, color palette, typography, that's the answer. Picasso, but I don't know. Now, strategy is the third, if you like, and I'm going to leave this to lecture 3 so they all come back, because it's lots of fun. And, but I didn't want to spend too much time on it because I think you all know what that is. It's about goals, but it's subtle, and we'll talk about it in terms of machine intelligence later. So this is sort of a schematic of what I've been telling you. There is some feature in the environment, like an apple, as I said before, and you represent it. And then you do inference on it, calculations, in order to achieve an output. This is the sort of universal structure of all intelligent systems. My colleagues would be saying to me, but isn't that just an adaptive system? And I'd say, yes. And we'll get to how they differ maybe tomorrow. Now, most cognitive scientists really are only interested in these things. They're interested in representation in your brain, an inference that you make, and the output. And they make an interesting assumption, which I'm going to challenge, and that is that representations are achieved by putting lots of stupid cells together, dumb cells, nerve cells. And inference, computation, on those representations, also done by dumb cells, right? But somehow, all that dumbness, if that's a word, is almost as good as ubiquity or whatever we had on the, I'm not sure what that was, but it's kind of intriguing, leads to magical Mozart. So extraordinary intelligence, in this case musical intelligence, comes out of extraordinary stupidity of cells aggregated. Now, this is a quote from Robert Nozick, the late Robert Nozick, a great philosopher at Harvard, and this is what he said. If there is to be an explanation of how our intelligence functions, it will have to be in terms of factors that, taken individually, themselves are dumb. For example, in terms of concatenation of simple operations performed by a machine. A psychological explanation of creativity will be in terms of parts or processes that are themselves, or not themselves, creative. So that's what I showed you before. This is the idea that have enough stupid cells together, you can create a really smart brain. Okay? I call that the strong emergence hypothesis. That is that somehow intelligence emerges out of scaling lots of stupid bits. It's how a computer works. Tons of integrated circuits, you have enough of them, and you can play, an incredibly intelligent game like World of Warcraft or Doom. Okay? And that idea comes from physics. It's basically hidden concept, borrowed from physics, borrowed from the idea of a phase transition. So at a given pressure and temperature, you all know this from the kitchen, as you increase the temperature, you go from a solid to a gas to a liquid. Somehow, just changing one thing is enough to lead to a qualitative change in the object. And that concept of the phase transition has been an incredibly pernicious concept in the study of brain. Many of my colleagues say, wait, it's the deepest concept in the study of brain. I want to tell you I think that's wrong. Okay? I have an alternative, which I call the weak emergence hypothesis. And it goes a bit like this. It says, if there is to be an explanation of how our intelligence functions, it will have to be in terms of factors that, taken individually, themselves are of lower intelligence. For example, in terms of concatenation of simple operations, a psychological explanation of creativity will be in terms of parts or processes that are themselves less creative, or in the limit, not themselves creative. I'm going to show you in lecture 3 that's why, or I claim, that's why we fail to make intelligent machines. Because engineering is about putting together stupid components to make smart objects. Evolution is about putting together smart components into intelligent aggregates. Your brain is like an ecosystem of organisms. It is not like a circuit of gates. And I'm going to now show you some evidence, indirect evidence of that hypothesis. I mentioned epilepsy. This is now the end, so we're at the very end. And procedures for excising brain regions to prevent epilepsy from propagating. The most extreme procedure you could perform would be to sever the connections between the two hemispheres entirely, resulting in really a single cranium with two brains, not connected. Okay? Now, under the strong emergence hypothesis for intelligence, what would happen if you were to cut your CPU in your computer in half? Well, it would go away, wouldn't work. Or maybe it would be half as powerful. Okay? Under the weak emergence hypothesis, you'd have two intelligences. Right? Because you can bisect it as often as you like, and there'll always be something there that's truly intelligent. Now, these procedures were in fact conducted, and they were conducted by a collaborator of ours called Mike Gazzaniga. He started off doing these experiments at Caltech with a colleague of Murray's called Sperry. And I'm now going to show you a video, and he'll explain to you what's going on, which I think will surprise you, and I might explain it again afterwards.
Joe, I'm going to show you some things.
So just as a quick remark, who you're going to see is you're going to see an interview with a patient who has had the two hemispheres severed. Okay?
Joe, I'm going to show you some things. I just want you to tell me what you see. And here we go. You ready? Look right at the dot. Okay. Right. Okay, you ready? Look right at the dot. Grapes. Good. When Joe focuses on a point, look right at the dot, everything to the right of the point goes to his left brain, the dominant hemisphere for language and speech. Look right at the dot. So we can see here that when we flash a word or a picture, Joe is easily able to name it. There we go. See it. Close your eyes and let your left hand do a little work.
So that went to his right hemisphere that doesn't do speech. But he can draw it with his left hand.
Okay, what do you got there?
Hand.
Okay, very good. Now, when a word or a picture falls to the left of a fixation point, that information goes to his disconnected right half brain. And as we can see here, Joe is unable to name it. Joe is able to draw the picture with his left hand, the left hand getting its major control from the right half brain. Where'd you draw?
Okay.
What'd you see?
Wheel. One side. I don't know where it's on the other.
So even though he can't name it, his left hand is able to draw out the picture of the stimulus of the picture or word that we presented to his right half brain. What did you see?
Hammer.
So just close your eyes and draw with your left hand. Just let it go. Nice. What's that?
Saw.
Yeah. What'd you see?
Hammer.
What'd you draw that for?
I don't know.
What Joe and patients like him, and there are many of them, teaches us is that the mind is made up of a constellation of independent, semi-independent agents, and that these agents, these processes can carry on a vast number of activities outside of our conscious awareness. Even though that goes on, there's some final stage or some final system, which I happen to think is in the left hemisphere, that pulls all of this information together into a theory. It has to generate a theory to explain all of these independent elements. And so, and that theory becomes our particular theory of ourself and of the world.
So this is a remarkable experiment if you think about it. It's saying that within your own head you hold two completely diametrically opposing views simultaneously. And if I ask you to articulate your position, you'll say one thing, but if I ask you to draw it, you'll say something totally different. Right? And these experiments have been continued. So you can ask one hemisphere, what would you like to be? It might say fireman. and the other hemisphere would say, I want to be a doctor. Okay? So you are not one person. Right? You're multiple people. You know this already because you'll say, I'm not sure I want to do. What do you mean you're not sure? Who's not sure? Okay? And so what's happening here is that you have, in fact, as I'll show you tomorrow, it goes much, much further than just two hemispheres. It goes all the way down to the cells. What you really have is you have cells and collections of cells voting to be heard. Okay? And they vote, and unfortunately, they're not all equal in the eyes of the world. The left hemisphere gets to cast the final vote, okay, and articulates what you think. But what you really think isn't one thing. Consciousness and intelligence is not unitary. Okay? It's the outcome of a competition among representations at multiple levels. And so this is what's going on. If you remember that picture, what you really have is multiple hypotheses. They're all competing, right? And somehow, through some process of election, one of those hypotheses wins through, and it's the one that you think you always meant. So here's the summary. For those of you falling asleep, I'm sorry. Intelligence describes at least three capabilities: representation, strategy, and inference, and they're solving hard problems in the sense of the Rubik's Cube. Search problems. All species possess this. I think by now you should understand that, and I'll show you tomorrow even more remarkable accomplishments. There are multiple levels within you that possess that, not just one. And that competition among these characteristics, representations and inferences, at one level form the representations and strategies at another, and the final level being the one that I might articulate. So in lecture 2, I'm going to take some of these ideas that you now comprehend effortlessly, and I'm going to tell you how it evolved, what makes a cell smart, how do smart cells make super smart brains, and how we as a species might be different. That is, what is the true nature of human intelligence? And I'll tell you right away, it's not language. Okay, that's what everyone will tell you. I think that's bogus. Now, just as a sort of fun closing video, some of you in the audience might be saying, oh, he's so steeped in this adversarial, competitive mindset. The world isn't like that. It's not competitive. And take a game like chess. I mean, after all, we play it to amuse each other. We play it because we enjoy it. And now, if this doesn't disabuse you of that idea, nothing will.
In chess, you have to have the talent, but the guys who reach the top are the ones who keep at it. They have the character. They don't get distracted by other things in life until they got the title or whatever they wanted out of chess.
Can you have any other life and be a great chess player?
Not at the moment, no. First things first, right? Get the title and...
And what's the pleasure? What's the moment of pleasure for you? Is it when you see the guy in trouble? Where's the greatest pleasure? Correspond to hitting the home run in baseball.
Oh, the greatest pleasure. Well, when you break his ego, this is where it's at.
Yeah? Yeah. Really?
Yeah.
And when does that occur? When he sees that he's finished?
Yeah, and he sees it's coming and breaks all up inside.
Good night. Thank you very much. You don't feel obliged to stay. As long as you come back, I will take a few questions if you have any. Yes, right here in the front.
In one of the first videos you showed us of the blindfolded Rubik's Cube,
Yes.
his hands were moving in motions that he was either rehearsing or were the actual representation that he was potentially using for doing that. I mean, he wasn't just looking at that cube.
He wasn't looking at all. So what was he doing? He was actually using something called Gould's algorithm. He was, if you can remember the configuration of colors on the surface of a cube, there is an algorithm, that is a sequence of rules, that's guaranteed to take you to the right solution. And that's the only way he could possibly do it. It's not that he's starting from scratch each time and mentally visualizing the configuration of the cube at each twist, as you were pointing out. In fact, that's a key concept. It'll come back in lecture 3. The way you solve hard search problems is by finding rules that you can represent efficiently. And so I think that's what you were seeing in the video. Yes. Let me go. Yes, please. Yeah, that's an interesting. You couldn't do that. You could not remember all of the muscle memories to solve that problem without an algorithm. I think you're right. I think he was asking himself, okay, I need to get this cube into a configuration where I know where the algorithm can be picked up, right? But he didn't say, okay, I know that I'm going to have to move it that way first, then that way, and that way, and memorize the entire sequence. He has an algorithm that he already knows. Because in some sense, the way to think about it is like this. He has to be able to solve that problem from any arbitrary initial condition. So it's not the particular muscle motion, because that'll only work for one initial condition. But it's true. He did have to memorize the rules, know where the algorithm was going to kick in to solve the cube. That's right. Yes, please.
I had a question actually about phenomenal consciousness.
About consciousness.
Yeah, specifically phenomenal.
Yes.
It strikes me that
Do you want to define phenomenal consciousness?
phenomenal consciousness
Yes.
is the subjective.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
So, what is what the field, the surface, the right, all of that sort of thing that you experience.
Yes.
You can't actually describe something.
Yes. So this has a very long history in the study of consciousness. Everyone understands that consciousness might be useful. It helps you solve problems. But what people don't understand is why awareness is necessary, right? So you go to the bathroom because that's important, but you don't necessarily have to have conscious awareness of it, right? And so the question is, why is awareness useful? And I think it's fair to say it's remained a philosophical problem to this day. It's not as if there's a scientific answer. What I think is going on, and it won't satisfy you because it's not an answer, I'm not sure it's even answerable scientifically, that question, is that there are multiple competing, as I suggested at the end, recommendations. And what consciousness is an average over those recommendations. So the left hemisphere, the locus, that finally articulates, is averaging over all of these inputs, many of which are incompatible, to come up with an average recommendation. And I think you could test that. Now, why does that have to have an awareness component? I don't know. Yes, there's a question here.
The ideas suggest they may be applicable at the super-individual level, the intelligence of groups or societies. Will you be talking about
Yes, I'll talk a lot about that. A lot about that in relation to machine intelligence, when we're talking now about the externalization of the representation. Yes. Let me go over here. Michael.
Your distinction between strong and weak emergence implies that there isn't a scaling. The reduction doesn't work at a certain point. Is that got from?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that I've always been curious about is why we're so bad at building intelligent machines that aren't basically just an illusion of intelligence, right? And there's been a lot of interest in how biology works, neural networks and so forth. And I think a lot of engineers haven't understood how biology works, because it's not, a neuron is not a gate. A neuron is an organism. And so I was simply alluding to the fact that the way real intelligent systems works is about aggregating components that have their own representational strategic goals, but at a lower level. And so I'm not denying the possibility of discontinuities. I'm just saying the model is wrong. One last one at the back, and I'll let you all go. I'm sure you're tired.
You were saying in the beginning that second law of thermodynamics about entropy increases, disorder increases. If disorder increases, how does intelligence evolve in the first place?
But that's the problem. So the answer to that is there's the possibility of entropy reducing locally. So on the aggregate, if you think of the whole universe, then statistically it has to be increasing and will increase until we fall apart. But you can have local violations. And so you're right. I mean, if entropy increased everywhere, then there would be nothing of any interest in the universe. Thank you very much for coming.